It's Wednesday, November 5th, and we've got our same two systems to track in the Western Pacific for the next several days. We've got Typhoon Kalmaegi now over the South China Sea today, and is now re-intensifying in all likelihood, and will continue to do so as it tracks towards the west and makes landfall in central Vietnam later this week. And the other system is really hard to miss on this view. It's a large tropical depression 32, sitting out here in the tropical Pacific. While it is broad right now, it's forecast to consolidate gradually for the next few days as it tracks towards the northwest. And once that is done, the system will likely find itself in a very favorable environment where models are in high confidence of significant intensification taking place. And this may well become a super typhoon as it tracks towards the northwest and bends to the west. And unfortunately today, the threat of a super typhoon impact, or at least strong typhoon impact to the Philippines, have increased markedly, and we'll talk about that in greater detail once we get past the stuff with Kalmaegi, though I will leave a timestamp to that if you want to skip ahead to that part of the video. But going ahead and getting into it with Kalmaegi, the system has now moved into the South China Sea today after impacting the Philippines for the past 24 hours. We do still have some impacts along the westernmost coast. We do still have Signal 3 and Signal 4 warnings as of the latest Pagasa advisory. Those will likely be dropped later today as the core of the system is now offshore, though throughout the rest of the afternoon we could still see some outer bands move in, and those could have heavy rainfall and tropical storm-force winds still with them. But beyond that, conditions will continue to improve along the western Philippines as they have in much of the central Philippines throughout the day today. And so looking into the future of this storm, we are now seeing the system try to recuperate itself over the warm South China Sea waters. We can see in the visible satellite loop a lot of deep convection now wrapping around a looks to be clearing eye, or at least attempting to clear eye in the visible satellite imagery, denoted by that little dimple you can see there at the end of the satellite loop here. And so this signifies that the system is already getting its act together, and with wind shear that has been decreasing for the past day, the system will likely be successful in re-intensifying, perhaps to a similar intensity that it was prior to the Philippines, maybe even stronger in some of the stronger solutions that we have in some of the model guidance. Taking a look at the environment of the system, we talked about how the shear would be decreasing as it went into the South China Sea. This is as it was over the central Philippines yesterday, and you can see the very significant shear that it was dealing with. Deep layer shear that was over 20 knots, and this was not just a speed shear, but this was also a vertical shear. As you can see, we had southwesterly flow at the surface with strong easterly flow aloft. Those are completely opposing each other and cause a very significant vertical shear that is pretty detrimental to a tropical cyclone. However, what we've seen today is a reversal of the surface winds. And so what you'll see is that as we go in time further into the South China Sea, the surface flow will flip from southwest to more southeast, and even easterly in this plot. And if you look across the winds across the entire troposphere, directional wise, they're pretty uniform. And really the speed shear is not all too high either. The deep layer shear at this point has now dropped to 10 to 15 knots. Now that is still moderate shear, and that may still put some pressure on the storm. However, this is a whole lot more manageable than 20 to 25 knots of shear than we had over the central Philippines yesterday. And so because of this, models are in general expectation that we'll see the system re-intensify perhaps significantly over the warm South China Sea waters. And again, this is also aided by the current structure of the system today that we're seeing as it moves back over water. And we can see this very clearly if we look at the Google DeepMind ensemble. You can see the very significant intensification that we see on the model. The model mean is a category 4 equivalent on the Saffir-Simpson scale. Like I said yesterday, it does seem like the ceiling for the storm in the South China Sea is higher than it was east of the Philippines. Now, if there is any good news here, the wind shear is forecast to increase again as we go towards landfall in Vietnam. And you'll see that here as we go into time on the GFS ensemble, or the GFS deterministic rather. And what we'll see is another reversal of the surface flow. We have some strong westerly flow across the equator, and that's going to cause some of this flow to turn out of the southwest near the surface. And again, this causes a significant vertical shear that ends up with the deep layer values getting towards 30 knots, at least on this model. General model range is about 20 to 25 knots of GFS, is a little bit on the higher end here on shear. But nonetheless, it will likely get to a more disruptive value or magnitude as we get towards landfall in Vietnam. Now, one question is, will this be enough to weaken the storm significantly? prior to landfall. And unfortunately, I don't think it will, because you can see this shear is increasing as we're very close to the coast of Vietnam. You can see in this little thumbnail here, this is the coast here, and that's the center of the storm. And by this point, this shear has only just kicked up to these higher values, and so we likely won't see the system weaken all too much before landfall. It may be a case where if it peaks as a Category 4 equivalent, we see it come in as a Category 3 equivalent. And that's generally what's shown on the Google DeepMind. Now, the mean does drop off pretty significantly towards landfall. I suspect it's because some of these models are a bit faster, so they're moving over land, so they naturally weaken faster. So that does drag down the mean a little bit. But I'd say overall for landfall, we could expect a Category 3 equivalent, which would be about on par to what we just had in the eastern Philippines. So while we are getting this shear to increase near landfall, it still very well could be of significant strength as a strong typhoon when it comes into Vietnam later this week. And that will also bring, alongside the wind impacts, significant storm surge along and north of where the system makes landfall, but also significant rainfall. And that will be a primary issue in further inland spots too, after the system starts to dissipate over land. And so putting all of this together, this is the current forecast from Pagasa. You can see remaining a typhoon as we track west into the South China Sea and making landfall in Vietnam by Thursday night or early Friday morning local time. That's the general expectation for most models. And after landfall, we would see the system rapidly weaken. They don't go too far out on this forecast because it is out of their area of responsibility, which is this black line here. But beyond this, it will be weakening and turning to a post-tropical low. But it will be, again, bringing heavy rainfall to inland areas of Southeast Asia, and that will increase a flooding risk across multiple countries as that system pushes in. And you can see across the western Philippines, still got some tropical storm force winds impacting the region. These typhoon force winds have likely left the zone, the area by now, but you can see the wide expanse of tropical storm force winds, which will continue to rake the western half of the Philippines, central Philippines more specifically, throughout the afternoon today. So stay safe in the Philippines as that comes through, and I'll likely talk about that again tomorrow before it makes landfall in Vietnam. But unfortunately for us in the Philippines, we can't rest easy as we have another system on the way in the tropical Pacific today. You can see Tropical Depression 32, a very large disturbance sitting in the tropical Pacific today. We talked about how this would be a pretty broad low to start off with, and this does spell some short-term struggles that the system will have to contend with over the next few days. And we talked about how for the Mariana Islands, Guam and north, we weren't going to be looking at a significant typhoon impacting the islands. Now, the center track will likely stay southwest of you all, but even then, we weren't talking about an intensifying typhoon getting close to you all. And this is exactly the reason why, and that's because this is such a broad system. And so for the next few days, what the system needs to do is work to make the low more tight and compact. As a large system like this, it can intensify to, some pretty high intensities, but for it to reach, the top end of typhoons that we've seen on some model guidance today, it does need to tighten the vortex more than where it is right now, as larger storms will tend to struggle to have maximum winds at the higher end of, say, Category 5, if you're looking for a Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale equivalent. However, models do show that happening, and the environment is getting more and more favorable as time goes on for the system to do that. And you can see it very clearly if we look at this closer view. Now, when we looked at this a day ago, the system was getting sheared out of the north because we had a little trough sitting over the Mariana Islands, and there was also a significant surge of northerly flow as a direct response from Typhoon Kalmaegi further west. But if we take a look at the upper low flow plot now from the model, what you'll see is the trough that was further north is now decayed. That is now gone, not bringing shear anymore to the storm. But also this northerly flow in relation to Kalmaegi further west is also now moving away from the storm. And we talked about how this would be backing west with the typhoon, as it is a direct response from that typhoon further west. And so what we see now today in the model field is expanding outflow in all directions from the storm. And what this promotes is lots of convective development around the system's core. And we're seeing that today. You can see across this entire gyre, a lot more convection is occurring over the entire low compared to yesterday when we just had more of a southern half, but banana-shaped region of convection. And so what this convection will gradually do for the next few days is work to tighten the vortex and make its wind field a little bit more compact and make it so that it can rapidly intensify at a more effective rate than a broad system like this would be able to. And we can see this happen if we look at the HAFS model. I'll go back to the beginning here. And again, you can see this very broad wind field here at the start. But as we go in time, we'll see it contract more. It gets more concentrated and symmetric around the system's center. And once that happens, we start to build an eye and eye wall structure. And then once that part of the forecast is done, or the phase of the system is done, then we see significant intensification begin to occur. And the model has been consistently showing throughout the day today very significant intensification taking place as it approaches the Philippines, which you saw the last frame there for a second. This is a very strong typhoon by this time as it nears the northern Philippines. And if we look at the upper level environment going forward, we can see exactly why this is going to occur. We've got a trough off to the north. This is not going to be a trough that picks it up and recurves it out to sea, unfortunately. This is just going to more benefit the intensification of the storm. So you'll see that we have this new outflow channel opening up to the north from this trough. We've got an increasing outflow channel to the west and to the east. So we've got 3 channels where the latent heat from the convective process is being exacerbated away from the storm. And so that means that the system has a very efficient convective process in the middle and can fully take advantage of the warm waters that we have here in this part of the Pacific. And really, these waters have not been tapped into at all this entire typhoon season. We've mostly had systems that were very close to land. I think the one exception is Super Typhoon Regasa in September. But that was further north, not in the main Philippine Sea. And so what you'll see on the sea surface temperature map from the HAFS model is a sea of red and pink, showing you very, very warm sea surface temperatures, which is high fuel for the storm. And another thing is that it's not just the fuel at the surface. This extends with great depth. And one issue that can sometimes happen with broader storms is that they get too big for their own good. So that tropical storm and typhoon force winds expand over a greater area. And so they end up upwelling water from beneath the surface to where by the time the eye gets over it, it's too cold to support the intensity that the storm is at. But with the high ocean heat content that we have, with storms really not tapping into the potential of the Philippine Sea this typhoon season, that means that issue may not really come at all for the storm. Even as it gains size, it will likely gain some size after contracting for the next few days as it goes through internal structural changes. And we saw that on the HAFS model going in here. This is still a very large typhoon, even though we did contract at the beginning of this. And so even though, say, on this model forecast, you don't see the winds being, category 5 force on the Saffir-Simpson scale, it's going to have the surge like a category 5 typhoon here. And so this is going to be a very significant and widespread event in all likelihood for the northern Philippines. And models are in, again, pretty much unanimous agreement on this kind of intensification occurring. And unfortunately, the forecast from Pagasa is also really high. This is one of their first forecast on the system. You can see becoming a super typhoon very quickly in the forecast. By Saturday morning, it's a super typhoon entering their area of responsibility, which is this black dashed line. And we really don't see too much weakening on approach to landfall. It does remain a super typhoon on this forecast. Now they're explicitly showing a super typhoon making landfall in Luzon by Monday morning. Now, you may ask, is there something that could weaken the system before landfall? And we did talk about that, how there would be increasing shear on approach to the northern Philippines. And this is still true in a lot of model guidance. You'll see on the GFS, they're just showing you the upper level wind plot across the entire West Pacific. This is the typhoon by this time. And what we'll see is there's increasing easterly flow across this entire region of the Western Pacific. Now, one thing to note is that this is not a strong vertical shear. It's sort of similar to what we were talking about in the South China Sea with Kalmaegi. It was dealing with vertical shear over the central Philippines, but now that the vertical aspect of that, so the wind changing direction with height, now that that is gone from Kalmaegi, it's more of a favorable shear configuration, even though it is still on moderate values, and that may still allow the system to re-intensify, perhaps significantly in the South China Sea. Sort of similar thing going here for this typhoon as it comes west. We'll see in the GFS that there's not a whole lot of change in the flow across much of the troposphere. And so even though we do have some significant deep layer shear taking place, because we do have 30, 35 knot upper level flow, and the mean shear is still 25 to 30 knots on this model, the fact that this is not a vertical shear, not a very strong vertical shear, means that it may not have as much of an impact on the TC as you might expect it would. And, I used my analog yesterday of Hurricane Beryl of 2024. That became a Cat 5 hurricane in the Caribbean in July in the Atlantic. And in July in the Atlantic, if you don't know, we have climatologically very strong easterly trades. So you typically have a lot of strong speed shear in place across the Caribbean in July in the Atlantic. That's why so many storms just don't form in the Caribbean early in the season there. But the fact that Beryl was so strong meant that its vortex, its structure, was more resilient to the impacts of this speed shear. And so it took a while for that speed shear to have a significant impact on the intensity of the hurricane. And that may be a similar case what we see on approach to the Philippines with this storm, is that we may peak out pretty strong out to sea, and we may start to weaken, but not at a very rapid pace like you would normally expect for these kind of shear values that we're seeing in the models. And that is a pretty agreed upon idea by the Google DeepMind ensemble. You can see the very strong peak out to sea, and then we really don't see it weaken all too much. The mean is still a category 4 on approach to landfall in the Philippines. And this may be a similar case to what we're seeing in Vietnam with the mean with Kalmaegi, that some of these members are also onshore by this point. So the mean is getting dragged down some in these members. So it may be even higher than this still on the Google DeepMind ensemble. And that's why Pagasa is going so aggressive on this, keeping it a super typhoon on approach to the Philippines. So unfortunately, the key messages today is that the probability of a strong typhoon impact to super typhoon impact for the Philippines have increased greatly, and it doesn't seem likely that we'll be avoiding this with the track. There is still, of course, some wiggle room in the forecast. You can see in this white area from Pagasa that this is where the track of the center of the storm could go, and so we could deviate to the south. We could also deviate to the north, and if it does deviate to the north, there does seem to be still some potential that maybe we sneak east of these islands and avoid a direct landfall in some outlier scenario from models. However, one thing I need to make clear is that this system, like I mentioned, is probably going to be growing in size through internal structural changes. We may see it that typically what happens in TCs when they get very strong is they undergo hour replacement cycles. And that's where a strong outer band of thunderstorms will form around the parent eye of this hurricane, or the typhoon in this case. And slowly throughout that process, it will effectively choke off that inner eye. And through that process, the storm may weaken some, but the net effect of it is because the storm is growing in size. That's why the winds come down, is that it's taking up a greater surface area. And we may see several of these take place over the next few days as this tracks towards the west-northwest, towards the Philippines. And so we see in the HAFS model by this point, this is a large typhoon by this point. So even if we have that outlier solution that maybe we could potentially avoid a direct landfall in those outlier solutions, note how we still have typhoon force winds, which could easily rake a large portion of the Philippines, but also islands further north like Taiwan and southern Japan. And just for some perspective here, I'll do a quick measurement across the typhoon's wind field. The purple here is typhoon force winds, and this is roughly 350 kilometers west to east, north to south. It's almost 400 kilometers wide of typhoon force winds here. And note how also when you get into these more white colors and more pinkish colors near the center, that's the very strong winds of super typhoon force. And note how that, unlike most typhoons, is not really kept to the immediate core. It's over a pretty broad area. And so that may mean that a large portion of the Philippines and surrounding islands further north may have risk of feeling the strongest winds in the eye wall of the storm. So this will likely be a very significant impact, and we'll have to watch this very closely for the next few days. Briefly, before I leave off talking about the track of this system, as I mentioned, there is still some wiggle room. One main steering feature that is keeping the system towards the west is a ridge over southern China. And there's also another ridge here. It's hard to see on this map, but it's east here across the subtropical or tropical Pacific. And these two ridges are going to be directing it towards the west for the next few days. You can probably see it better here if we look at the upper level plot from the GFS. And you can see that, again, here's those two high pressure centers directing the system to the west. But as we go in time, this ridge is going to be pushing towards the east. And we'll see eventually that as the system is near the Philippines, now it's on the southwestern side of this parent ridge off to the east. And so this will start to turn the system to the north. And that's where the idea of potentially some of those outlier solutions, see if I can pull them up here, like the European shows, some of these outlier solutions that are further north, that's the ones that are taking it out to sea and potentially still avoiding a landfall. However, the most significant or the most likely scenario right now is that this continues tracking west and makes a direct landfall in the Philippines. The probability of that has increased drastically, and you can see pretty much every Google DeepMind Ensemble member makes landfall in the Philippines. And that's why the forecast from Pagasa is showing this very clearly for the next few days. So I'm going to have to watch this very closely for the next few days, and I'll, of course, have various videos on this over the next week as this tracks towards the west. Stay safe again in the Philippines as Kalmaegi continues bringing impacts there today, and I'll have more videos on this system as well as it tracks west towards Vietnam later this week. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.